AI is everywhere. From boardrooms to bedrooms, the promise of artificial intelligence is reshaping our world at lightning speed. But beneath the excitement lies a crucial question: are we witnessing a revolution, or are we caught in a bubble? Now, today we're diving into a provocative idea that there isn't just one AI bubble, but there are three. Now, from sky-high stock valuations and massive infrastructure spending to hype that outpaces reality, each bubble tells a story about our hopes, fears, and the future of technology. In this episode, we'll unpack these bubbles, challenge assumptions, and explore how businesses and investors can navigate a world where AI is both opportunity and illusion. So welcome to Convergence. I'm Lauren Hockersoffer from Zurich.
I'm Faisal Haq from Stamford, Connecticut.
Convergence is a series dedicated to exploring the pivotal intersections of technology, business, and leadership. Faisal, so AI, it's not one, not two, but three bubbles, which makes me wonder, should we be worried? Or should we just start investing in bubble wrap? Now, jokes aside, let's start at the beginning. What exactly are these three AI bubbles and how do they differ from each other?
I think we can be both pessimistic and optimistic. The reason we say it's three bubble, not one, is because it's from three different angles, right? The first angle is if you look at the sky-high valuation of all these tech and AI companies, especially the larger ones, and it's hard to kind of qualify what's driving the higher stock prices because the fundamentals are not quite there in the sense that spending versus earning versus value add, it's not quite there, right? So first bubble is the asset bubble, and we've seen that in the Dotcom era, where a lot of these companies get very highly valued and then it just drops, and it has huge impact on the overall market, but also to all the investors who has invested in those companies. And because the tech sector is one of the bigger driver for the capital markets in general, that has a huge implication, right? So that's one. Second is there is what we call the infrastructure bubble, in the sense that there's a huge amount of capacity, if we can call it capacity, infrastructure meaning capacity, is being built, whether the data center, chips, GPU, et cetera, right? So there's a huge amount of infrastructure is being built, but not necessarily all infrastructure is yet being used, and where it's used, it's quite expensive in many ways, right? So if you look at just from a consumer point of view, the more you use, the more bigger bill you get from your large language model. But that's just a tiny piece of the overall infrastructure market, right? So question is, are we going to create overcapacity? Because frantically we're building these things. I don't know whether you heard, not just in the US, but even in China, they're building data center underneath the water to keep the data centers cool. And I think there's a story whereby the Meta, the parent company of Facebook, is building a data center the size of New York City and San Diego, and it's going to require power supply that's going to be equivalent to running major cities and states, right? So Amazon is doing the same thing and other folks are doing the same thing. Last but not the least is this hype versus reality bubble, right? Meaning what we're hyping and what's really real, and when does the reality becomes a key factor for making all sorts of decisions, both from a business and from a personal point of view. So those are the three bubbles.
It's interesting you've got the three bubbles. Was this, and you can see the accessibility in the outline of the three bubbles, but you wrote an article on this as well. Did you coin this term, the three bubbles? I imagine that many people are extremely familiar with the avenues that are presented by these three bubbles. And people are, in my opinion, always familiar with the last one, which is the hype bubble, because this is about the overhype that comes with the expectations that surround technologies, AI technologies in particular. So did you coin the first two bubbles, or where did this term, where did the classification of these bubbles come from?
My team are constantly looking at these things, both from a practitioner point of view, but also from a research point of view. And I've lived through the internet bubble. And my very first book I wrote around the internet bubble, which was 2000 timeframe. At that time, I was arguing that there's the technology bubble and there's the business bubble. I don't know whether we coined it. I haven't seen anybody talking about three bubbles. But when we thought of writing this, we're looking at it. Look, there's a really different impact that happens from bubble burst, right? So, and there's also opportunity that gets created because of the bubble burst, right? So we looked at it from that angle, that there is a market impact, there is a infrastructure impact, and there is a actual hype where people just come out of the hype and then gets real in terms of where the real value is being created and where it's not created.
So do you think, though, that we are in, so if you were to analyze the three different angles of those bubbles, do you think that we are in an asset bubble? From my understanding, asset bubbles are like maybe there's signals in stocks that would indicate that, valuation growth massively outstrip revenue growth, unit economics. You've also got the heavy reliance on uncertain elements or indicators around AI-driven revenue, rather current cash flow. And also, I think as well, leverage lending and funding that is heavily reliant upon borrowed capital to sustain this capex without immediate returns. I mean, that goes into the conversation of the hype bubble of an example of the MIT study, etc., the ROI, which we'll probably go into in terms of discussion around the third bubble. But do you think that we're in a asset bubble?
Yeah, I would think most investors and most analysts would agree that we are kind of in asset bubble, because if you look at the amount of money that's being poured in and the amount of revenue that they have to generate is disproportional, right? So that's very fundamental, right? So you have to spend money to make revenue, but when does the revenue catches up? So the pace of the spending is monumental in terms of anything AI. And I think other day in Bloomberg, somebody was talking about that you'll need like trillions of dollars for makeup in terms of revenue to make up for that AI spending around AI, R&D, and other things. So the question is, when does that happen? And meaning when does the revenue catches up with the spending? And in the meantime, we are evaluating on this speculation, right? These are speculative market outlook. So when you have speculative market outlook, that's when the price is going up, meaning stock prices are going up, which is essentially valuation of the companies are going up. That's a classic indicator of that there is a asset that are overhyped, and there would be a bubble because market will have to correct itself, right? So most people will agree that we are in some sort of, investors that are enjoying this uptake, myself included, but at some point this is gonna get corrected one form or another.
Obviously, the sort of projection around a market correction, but what I'm thinking about just now is that I think that there's so much interdependency, and I find it quite clever how you've positioned it as these three bubbles, because there is that interdependency, especially with technologies. I think that because of the nature as well of the second bubble, which is the infrastructure bubble, where you need to make an investment in AI infrastructure, including like GPUs, power systems, you mentioned the cooling technologies, etc., that there is that dependency that then fuels the hype around, how are they being used, the pricing, and then that goes into the asset bubble that's almost impossible to sort of deviate away from. The one as well, like the hype bubble, which we're in ourselves, I notice being immersed in the field that we are very much in the hype bubble, and there's people that are exterior to not working in AI technology that don't understand the hype that is due to widespread media coverage about AI, and we're very much immersed in that. But if you look at for example, the hype bubble, do you think that that's bursting a little? I mean, there is that example of the famous MIT study where it does say that, 95% of AI pilot projects fail to generate returns. But again, one thing that I always say to people here is that the research was based on 150 interviews. It was a survey of 350 employees. So is it really relevant or representative if we're talking about, a minimization of a hype bubble or a burst of a hype bubble? What's your opinion there?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think you're right on in terms of that MIT study is very limited. I mean, it's a small amount of data to make a broad brush that 95% things are failing. But I will tell you, from working with both private sector and public sector customers, it's the adoption and the value creation is not quite there. I think there's a lot of value that's being created in terms of efficiency, whereby smart people and smart workforce are adopting on an individual basis and on organizational basis various aspects of AI. And by the way, there's many layers of technology infrastructure, meaning AI technology infrastructure. So when you look at a predictive analytics, when you look at a workflow automation, when you look at decision support, there's a lot of value that can be created from the AI technology. So the hype is in the sense that when we start talking about how accurate is a large language model, how far are we from having the self-healing, artificial intelligence technologies in general, when we talk about the general intelligence or AGI, those are a little hype because I think we're not quite there yet. And it'll be a while to get to that level of accuracy and whatnot. But I think there is a lot of value that can still be generated from the current technology. But that doesn't come from the technology. It comes from understanding your mission, purpose, and the cultural element of your organization and where the use cases are of those technology to make you a better value creator.
So I think that that's a really good segue, and it comes back to the starting point of what you've just highlighted in that exploration there about the hype versus the reality from the study and going away into the reality. So we have to somewhat separate genuine breakthroughs, I imagine, from the overhyped promises. As you indicated, I think one way to do that is for organizations or individuals to really look at the mission and the purpose and start to identify measurable business outcomes that come from the implementation of their projects, which might be solely like revenue reduction on OPEX. It could be, cycle time, error rate. And I think that is progressing. What I did see that also interestingly contributes to that is that Google have just recently released another report about the state of generative AI. I read it yesterday. It was quite interesting because what it had communicated is that healthcare is actually becoming one of the leading industries for real life deployment of AI implementations. So if we look at, for example, healthcare and manufacturing, because they're two that have demonstrated an influence, and also use cases like automation or workflow automation. How can we make sure that you separate genuine breakthrough from overhyped promises there?
I mean, look, the healthcare is very near and dear to my heart because of my personal situation with my son.
Yeah.
If you look at that industry as an example, there's ideas of, humanoid robots coming and checking on you and doing surgery on you. There's that. And someday we probably will get to that point. But the basic stuff already is having enormous impact. So for example, if you're looking at drug discovery and you have large amount of data and you're analyzing the data to come to a new discovery, which is really all about informatics at the end of the day. There's a huge application of that. A remote area where you can do basic diagnostic. We're not talking about sophisticated diagnostic, but basic diagnostics. So there's lots of opportunity in terms of value creation in healthcare space. And same with manufacturing, by the way, because, last time in our last episode, we talked about procurement as an example and how that can be heavily enabled and helped with AI. Manufacturing is a lot about procurement because of the fact that you have to buy raw material and then you manufacture or create something and then you create a new product. So optimizing supply chain procurement process, AI already can add a huge amount of value. So you have to get very pragmatic in terms of where do you want to utilize this technology. Like, somebody who talking about healthcare, you and I talked about this. I wish my mother had a humanoid robot when she was suffering from dementia and was at a nursing home because she would often switch to our native language and the caregiver wouldn't understand it. So if you had a translator device that, like you can do that with the iPod, AirPods, right, or other type of devices, and go farther and have a humanoid robot that's much more patient than human. But those are all things coming.
Yeah, so they are coming, and the basic things are possible. But then, I mean, it's interesting because I've been in recent discussions with a lot of people, and we're going completely off tangent, but you've also got vibe coding, right? And there's a lot of company that have now realized that there's, from a capital perspective and revenue perspective, that there's a lot of opportunity to travel down the path of building something to offer as vibe coding. And it's become extremely popular. If you take Lovable as an example, it's become a huge hit because it offers the capabilities to vibe code and then provide the service. You've got your website, etc. But if you look at organizations like Lovable, there's an opportunity there for them to actually capitalize and profit just from hype. Like, I think that they've conveyed that one of the reasons that they became so successful is because of this hype bubble. And things like, AirPods in, and then you get the translation of your language to another language. Is this good utilization of also the second hype bubble, which is the infrastructure that's being built, which also has quite a heavy impact on the environment, sustainability efforts? There's also governance that's required for that. So what lessons do we need to learn? And you lived through the Dotcom era. Like, what lesson are we not learning, and do we need to learn from what happened there? Is there similar patterns?
We can unpack this question in many different ways. Well, let's start with what's the difference between the internet bubble and what we're going through now. The speed of change and the impact of this technology is far more greater than when we had internet, because internet was just a connector, right? So we're talking about a self-evolving, self-learning technology, has monumental human impact, but that also requires a lot of power, meaning capacity, power, electricity, power, meaning what we're feeding it to so that it can self-evolve, the knowledge, etc., etc. So it's quite different than having just creating a basic connectivity like we did with internet. Evolved, a lot slower pace compared to what we are seeing in the last 5 years or 7 years. Behind the scene, it has been growing, but it just came in the forefront in the last 3-4 years, all terms of things we're talking about. If you think about sustainability and if you think about the global impact of this, it's monumental. And you can look at it from 2-3 point of view. Point one is that it is going to have an impact on how do we feed this beast and what impact it has in terms of capacity, meaning that what happens to intellectual property, what happens, how do we power it, what happens to the residual stuff that is going to get created because of these massive data centers that we're building up, the impact on natural resources because of the things we need to create these infrastructure, etc. Right? So that's one element of it. The other element of it, which we're seeing it more and more, maybe last week when the UN had quite a bit of discussion around the AI and the governance of AI, and are we creating the next level of digital divide? Because, when you really think about AI, it's going to be controlled and harnessed by handful of big infrastructure folks, and rest of us are in various degree of consumer users and creators based on this infrastructure and based on these things. So, and then you just saw that 11,000 people just got laid off from Accenture. I mean, there's all kind of layoff going on already.
Yeah. But there's actually been a lot of speculation around the change in the development of younger generations for future workforces. So it's an interesting topic that you bring up. I also read that the Google CEO had recently communicated in a large conference that children should think about, and it goes back to the vibe coding example and also the use of tools like Claude Code, etc., is that children should now think about the possibility that the infrastructure per se is actually going to replace jobs like software engineers. So I remember that we used to say like 5 years ago, and it was a hot topic around the conviction of accessibility to coding courses for younger generations. It's now done full spin, 360, that we're now encouraging younger generations to move into the development of critical thinking rather than computational skill sets. So that's really interesting how that's changed. And that also makes me think about the implications of the utilization and the development of the infrastructure itself, because that will change. And it's also the speed of, it goes back to the adoption question. Like, will companies really adopt Gen AI to the extent that it will then cause new workloads of different directions? Because data is also a consideration in the infrastructure argument. There's cases where there's not enough data, so then we're moving to synthetic data, which has a question around representation in data. So there's so many fascinating things that adhere to the development of that particular infrastructure bubble. What I want to talk about as well is the future. So, like, despite the bubble, where is AI actually delivering value today? And how can we separate long-term from short-term hype?
So there's also opportunity because of this mad rush to monetize from these type of technology. So if you are a regular business who's not in technology business, you now have lots of opportunity to experiment and do a lot of different things because this infrastructure is being built and you have all this investment that's in application and tools like the ones you're talking about. And when the bubble bursts, everything kind of becomes cheaper. So in that way that you will have ready-made infrastructure and ready-made tool to do a lot of experimentation. What I suggest any business leader, it's not in tech business, but like you're saying, healthcare or manufacturing or defense or whatever the case may be, is keep an eye on the commercial offerings and keep honing your business strategy and keep honing your authentic offering that you bring to your customer and to your partners, and think about where you can use these readily available things for your advancement. And then don't lose the cultural and human aspect of it, because your culture and people are tied to your authentic offerings. They're all interconnected. The reality is, Laura, there are a couple of things that are very easily predictable in the sense that when things are overhyped, it bursts. Whether that's asset bubble, infrastructure bubble, or the hype bubble, as we talked about. But we also don't know when, where, how these things will crumble or change, or where the opportunities are going to be created because of the unpredictable, fast-paced nature of the industry that's moving.
Both. I do agree with that. But I think that to add on to everything that you said, because there's a lot of importance in what you've expressed, there's immediate value, in my opinion, being created by those that are somewhat obvious from the implementation of retrieval augmented generation stack, so the fundament of search. Also the empowerment of the supercharging of knowledge workers, as well as any form of co-pilot, co-researcher, like co-developer, whatever there is in the simulation and the support. But I think that one thing that I always hear is, like, multiple times from people that are maybe quite distant from the measurement in the KPIs and the ROI on AI implementation, is that, there's a question about how AI is benefiting productivity. And a lot of people say, you can't measure productivity. It's not possible to measure productivity in the implementation of AI. And I'm like, well, of course it's possible to measure productivity gains, because one thing that is imperative and is a fundament of the implementation is that you're switching half of your organization and workforce to becoming data-driven. And this is something that's been pushed in the market for years. Organizations need to be more data-driven and less subjective. So there's very much ways that you can actually prove productivity gains from a data-driven perspective.
Absolutely.
The last thing as well is, obviously, what we've spoken about, the verticalized automation that is becoming ever more present, that is very much now in things like, pharma and manufacturing.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, you can look at just a simple thing in terms of productivity. Okay, how long is it taking you to make a decision? So if it took you a week to gather data and then analyze data versus if it takes you a couple hours, right, there is productivity. Right? So the question is, what do you do with that free time, right? So that becomes a impact question. That's not productivity again. So impact would be, okay, so you made the decision and what do you do with it, right?
So let's make a bet. Which bubble's going to burst first? Is there one of the bubbles that's going to be more transparent and bursting first?
I say that the hype cycle is already happening. So that bubble is already bursting, and this overestimation of where these technologies are, that's happening. I think the next one would be your capital market or assets, because I don't know how you sustain this kind of valuation when you cannot justify the fundamentals. But that's just my humble opinion. I'm not a market expert by any means, but just somebody who's in business and in the market and follow the market and understand basic business principle.
Yeah, I would completely agree. I think that's the one to watch. I think that the market will consolidate and shift. I myself as well, I'm not a market expert, so anyone that's listening and watching, don't take any sort of financial direction. But I do think that there is an indication in following all the capital that's being pumped into the market in various different directions around tech. Investors have sort of aggressively repriced large cap tech on AI expectations. And firms are also announcing massive AI capex and strategy shifts, which, can be justified if the revenue margins and adoption follow.
Absolutely.
So thank you for everyone that's joined us today and listened. I hope that you found our exploration of the three bubbles enjoyable.
Thanks for being with us.